Hello and welcome to this Shrine of Remembrance podcast. My name's Laura Thomas and I'm the production coordinator here at the Shrine. The Shrine of Remembrance acknowledges the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the land on which we honour Australia's servicemen and women, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Kaurna people, the traditional owners of the land on which our guests are speaking with us from today. So, with me, I have two very special guests to talk about the Shrine's new podcast, Lust, Love, Loss Conversations. Now, this podcast is a three-part series produced by renowned broadcaster Megan Spencer that delves deep into stories of Australian wartime relationships. These podcasts follow the tales of three different couples from meeting to marrying and everything in between. And it's all set against a backdrop of service. So with me now is Megan Spencer, who's the host of this podcast. Megan is a broadcaster, documentary maker, and a podcaster. She spent a decade working as the film critic for Triple J Radio, while also co-hosting SBS TV's The Movie Show. She's also been a program presenter on ABC Local Radio in Sydney, Darwin, and Bendigo. And recently she's moved into the remembrance space, recording real life stories about war, peace, and the impact of service. Hello, Megan.
Hi, Laura. Thank you.
Thanks for
Hi,
coming.
Julia.
Hello. And we have Julia Michel with us. So Julia is one half of a couple that features in the podcast. Her husband Jai is serving full-time in the Australian Army in an infantry capacity. And Julia is also the founder of the Defence Partners and Carers Support Group on Facebook. And she also runs her own blog, which is called the Home Post AU. So hello, Julia, as well.
Thank you. Lovely to be here tonight.
Now, Megan, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about the podcast series. What is it all about?
Well, you kind of said it before, Laura. Lust, love, and loss. The three L's, I guess, they're the central focus of the conversations. I mean, it wasn't literally explored, but those sorts of ideas and themes were explored along the trajectory of each conversation. So each of the podcast episodes, then there are three, goes for about an hour. And the first one is with Julia. So we get really a deep dive into the perspective of a defence spouse, a defence partner with Julia, who's an amazing speaker. So I'm just going to embarrass you a little bit, Julia.
Oh, thank you.
And also, while the focus is very much on Julia's perspective of what it's like to live, in a defence partnership, especially one where, your partner isn't around very much, which is certainly in her case. Well, Julia does give that particular perspective. The other couples also bring unique perspectives to this area that we're exploring, love, lust, and loss. And I guess how that pans out, it's not the same for everyone, but there are some really interesting shared similar themes that have come out across the course of those long conversations. So it's a deep dive, but there's also lots of sound design in these podcasts too to give you a bit of context and keep you entertained.
And these are hour-long podcasts, so there was a lot of research on your behalf, Megan, that went into this. How did you stumble upon Julia and Jai's story?
Well, actually, I've got to tip my hat to Beck Rayner, and also someone that you work with at the Shrine called Tessa, who tipped me off about Julia. She had a list of potential candidates for me to have a bit of a look at. And Tessa had come across Julia in the Military Wife Life podcast, which is now called Military Life, which is a fantastic, dedicated podcast for the defence community run by, as I mentioned, Beck Rayner. So I had a listen to it, and I didn't want to double up on that particular episode because Julia and Jai do feature in it, but I just thought it might be really interesting and a little bit more unique to have reflections of what it's like to live a defence partnership from one person's point of view, and in this particular case, the military wife's point of view, and tease out some of the things that Julia spoke about in that other podcast. So I think we took it to a different place, didn't we, Julia?
Yeah, we certainly did. It's an amazing episode. Like, I had tears when I listened back to it around how gentle the story has been treated. But yeah, also like quite a lot when you listen back to it and hear your own story played back to you. So yeah, it was very, very cathartic.
Oh, that's great to hear. And I think that's one of the great things about podcasts too, or documentary in general, that you can reflect back to the person that you speak with, how you perceive their life and tease out some of the bigger themes. So I guess one thing I have learned from interviewing and also being around veterans and families of service people is you need a lot of empathy. You need to be able to walk in other people's shoes and listen deeply. And I mean, Julia is an incredibly articulate person. I mean, she trained initially as a lawyer, so I mean, you would be fearsome, lady.
It
On
definitely
the
shows.
stand,
It
I want you
definitely
in
shows.
my corner. You're an advocate.
Julia,
Thank you.
how did it feel to be approached for this? Did it feel kind of bizarre speaking so intimately, because it is a real insight into your and Jai's relationship? How was that process for you?
It was very cathartic. So at the point in time that this episode was um, recorded, Jai had just come back due to a medical incident. So he had posted home early, and that had been a lot on top of 2 years of living apart in separate states for service reasons. And it had been really hard because I also had chronic injuries that had come about in those years. And yeah, it was a lot. And so it actually was very healing to do the podcast at the point in time that we actually got to record it, because I'd just come out of the 2 weeks isolation from him being home. We had to do home quarantine. And yeah, to be able to reflect on what was such a tough time, because it's certainly not just easy when they come home and you've got reintegration to go through, and dealing with trying to recover from the previous few years. The podcast was very cathartic in that for me, and it's something that I hope other partners can get from telling their stories, and any awareness we can create within society around how to be empathetic, how to, as Megan said, deeply listen and respect their stories and find ways. They don't always want you to solve their problems or have solutions for them. Part of the fix is just having those listening ears and someone who can show them some care. So I hope that that's what partners can take away, or any listeners can take away from this podcast.
I think just listening to you speak again, Julia, one of the things that really struck me about yourself and also to the other two defence couples that I interviewed is just the bravery involved and the uniqueness. I mean, this is something that we don't talk about very often in the mainstream. Certainly not. I mean, if you even look at the news now, how often do we even see wars covered on our news? I guess unless you watch SBS, but we really don't know much about where our people are, where our defence people are and what they're doing. Generally speaking, especially if you rewind it maybe 10, 15 years, it was on the nightly news on commercial stations quite a lot. So I think there's an invisibility that has really crept in with defence families and defence couples. And just when you sit and listen to people tell you intimately about what they go through, what their experiences are, I was just in shock. It really quite beggars belief. And I also felt really that there was a lot of courage involved. There's a lot of fortitude. I'm not going to use the R word, Julia, because I know resilience is overused everywhere these days. But there's an incredible amount of, like, on one hand, vulnerability and fragility, but on the other, staunch courage and just, I guess, survival instincts a lot of the time, and resourcefulness. I will say that R word, that, to try and make your life as good as possible. But the isolation also, and the separation, and having your life controlled by a very unique employer, actually. You've got to go and do a lot of stuff when people say, I think that's stuff that really we need to tease out and talk about much more, because there are impacts and consequences that go along with, the great stuff that's involved in defence life, but also I think there's another side to it that's not so great that I think we really need to look at more deeply. And it's not just someone getting damaged from their work. It has ripple effects into a couple, a family, and also into the community. And we all need to be aware of that, and I think be responsible for it.
And in the podcast with Julia, I find that that's a really big theme that's explored. And Julia, you're quite a big advocate for families of those that are serving. Have you experienced that kind of invisibility that Megan's speaking about? Are people often surprised when you tell them all the hoops that you have to jump through and the hurdles that you've come across over the last few years?
Yeah, I think people sometimes take it with a grain of salt when you say, like, you've never felt as invisible as when you became a defence partner, or since you've been a defence partner. I think people think that we get a lot of voice and a lot of say in what we do. And maybe around how the house is dusted or the chores are performed, that's true. But outside of that, we don't get that much choice in things. A lot of things are kind of dealt to us. And I think I said it in the podcast. My husband says, this life is thrust upon partners, because that's how little choice they actually get. And certainly, we've both been surprised by the hands that we've been dealt, and how our story has played out, as far as, resources that have existed, support that is lacking or insufficient, and just, the general compassion displayed by people, with how much it's taken with a grain of salt when you tell your story. And I think, my sister-in-law actually said to me when we had the battle to get Jai home last year, she said, I've always heard you guys say how it is, and I've, always gone, oh, okay, you can't make it home for Christmas this year, you can't travel, or, there's duty or something like that. So I've always understood that. She was like, but until I've heard you talk about the last 2 years, and in particular his journey home, from MWDU last year, she said, I didn't appreciate or actually understand what you were going through. And she said, now I have an appreciation, like I see that there are these hoops and you're having to jump through them, and I understand the toll that takes on you and what you're dealing with. So it was quite amazing as well to hear that from somebody, and then be able to do the podcast. And there was so much catharticism around my journey at that point in time, because at that time I wasn't coping the best. I didn't know that I wasn't coping the best, and it was honestly the hardest point in my life to date, and I thought I dealt with some pretty hard things.
Yeah, this is a COVID story as well. This is a very contemporary Victorian overlaid story. The borders slammed shut and kept you apart even longer than you already have been, with, various postings and Jai's 2 deployments to Afghanistan. And I've got to say, look, huge props to your husband too, Julia. I didn't set out to interview him, but I did invite him to be part of this podcast. You do get to hear his voice in a really beautiful way. And I guess we could say this is a bit of a collaboration. I had this idea that, well, when Julia and I did a few phone calls before the interview, and she told me how they kept in touch and said that they'd written to each other during Jai's first deployment to Afghanistan, over 3,000 emails to each other and texts. So I said, well, what about, could I get you to get some of those out, and would you guys read them, and I'll record it and put it into the podcast as part of, I guess, the love story, as tracking their relationship, and also how, the communication with each other. And he said yes. So he was fantastic. And I'm actually really proud of that, in a creative sense, but also in a storytelling sense. We had fun doing it too, didn't we? And it just sounds so beautiful, and you can hear how close they are through what they wrote to each other, and the voices. And I think this is a big part of it. This is about voice. This is about giving voice to a defence partner, to a defence couple. That's really, I think, to answer your very first question, Laura, that's what it's about, giving voice to defence partners and defence families. It's much needed.
And I think, Megan, you do such a brilliant job of inviting us into the very intimate experience of that defence relationship and that defence partnership, and through kind of the conversations that they're having. As someone who has a history, or has family history, in military, were you surprised by anything that you heard in particular?
Oh, for sure. Look, my grandfather and his brothers were in World War II, and one of them was in World War One. But I'm new to this, and in a way, it's great that I am. Like I did a big podcast for the Australian War Memorial a couple of years ago. Um, it's extraordinary. Once I started on this path, I haven't looked back, and this is the space that I work in pretty much exclusively now. But I really, as a young person, didn't want to know about my grandfather's story. I watched my dad over the years obsessively, he would probably say otherwise, but obsessively read books about the war in Germany, because my grandfather, his dad, was a prisoner of war in Germany during World War II. He was captured on Crete. But I just didn't want to know. And I guess it was a generational thing. I kind of grew up in the 70s and 80s, and Anzac Day was being very heavily challenged at that time, and it was being really rethought, and people were rejecting it. How is this relevant to me? All that sort of stuff. But I had the fortune to move to Germany for a couple of years, and I thought, because I'm a broadcaster, I might go and visit a couple of the sites of where my grandfather was interned, as a prisoner of war. Well, I'll tell you what, once I started, my whole world just completely changed. And I just kept discovering things, and it was like, is that for real? Are you, oh my gosh. And I was constantly surprised. So yes, I'm constantly still surprised when I speak to defence people, even though I know much more now. And I guess I know the language and the landscape more. I'm not a service person myself, but I certainly have a deep appreciation for what that is, and remembrance, of course. So I was absolutely, like, I sit there and go, wow, when I hear people tell their stories like Julia.
And Julia, do you have constant relationships with other people who are service partners, and you're sharing your stories? Are you often surprised by their experiences as well? Is it kind of a collaborative sharing environment?
Yeah, and I think everybody has so many different stories. Like, the experiences from partner to partner are so varied. So, when I met Jai, I was studying at the time, and my experience as a defence partner studying and then joining him in location and my first move is quite different to my friends who are studying and have posted around at the same time. And there's all these different facets that come into things like that, like the rules at the institution that you're studying with. Can you transfer your degree? The industry that you're going into, is your job transferable? Your skill base set. So when you get to where you are going to be, what does employment in that location look like? Because it might not be the job that if you'd graduated uni, you'd have been able to apply for in Brisbane. And then, like, my journey as a carer has been different as well. But I think through opening up and telling our stories a bit more, one of the reasons that I created the carers group on Facebook was because I wanted to share with other partners everything that I've learned around when they're medically downgraded. What does the home front support look like? What's supposed to be in place? What are the right questions to ask our rehab coordinators? How far do you go getting involved as a partner? I've had some really positive feedback from partners about the support that their partners have been through medical downgrades before, and they were never told about how they can get in-home services while still servicing to take some of the load off. So to see that starting to come to fruition for partners, to see the recognition and the onflow of that will be to people, our members of parliament, to our representatives, who will start to go, okay, so maybe it wasn't that there wasn't a need. Maybe it is a question around education, and making sure that the messages are delivered to the right people at the right time. That will hopefully start to shift the landscape of support that we find ourselves in at the moment.
Megan, do you think that this kind of podcast and this series is going to be kind of a vehicle for change in that sphere?
Gee, wouldn't that be nice? I didn't think about it, except actually, listening to Julia speak in particular, because she is an advocate, and she's got like an expansive mind, like she's got a mind that retains a lot of information. It would be great, and it is definitely needed, and it's definitely possible. So I suppose, yes, it crossed my mind, if we can get this out there and people, lots of people start to listen to this, including, representatives and politicians, but also the general public. I think awareness, is the start of change always. Um, but also, I think the other thing is, while there is a uniqueness to this life, and I think the partners, if they're not a service person, in a sense, kind of join up. They kind of have to, because it's a huge system. While you hear how unique the life is and how different it can be, say, from civilian life, you all also get to hear the similarities, as well. We cross over. It's not such a different, weird, odd, unusual space. There's so much humanity that's really shared, and in all of the episodes, you just completely relate to people as human beings. That you could be friends with, or you might be a neighbor to, or something like that. So I think that's another way for change. It goes back to empathy. I think really being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, somebody else's, not even mindset, but world, their set of experiences. And I think that's what this podcast series really does. And, kudos to everyone who was so brave enough to speak about their personal experiences so honestly as well. This is the great privilege I have as an interviewer and a podcast maker or documentarian, whatever. I get to listen firsthand, and then I get to work out how to sort of deliver that to people so that it goes straight in here, but straight in here too, straight into their hearts and minds. Yeah.
And Megan, take me through that process, a peek behind the curtain, if you will, because they are such intimate stories. How do you go about approaching such a big story and creating it into a narrative that people can listen to in an hour?
Look, I think I've spent the last, gee whiz, 7 years now. Let's say 5 or 6 years, kind of slowly immersing myself in the remembrance space, and with what comes with that is, the military space as well. I mean, it's massive, and once you start, well, I've found once you start, you can't stop. It's like when you go out on those pilgrimages or battlefield tours in, say, Belgium. You just keep meeting people who are searching for something, and then you become one of them. I could show you around this little room. I mean, this is the engine room here, but I've just got like this nerd shelf full of history books, military history books and remembrance books, and I've got bits and pieces of stuff that I've collected on my own travels. It happens like on this computer, like it's not very spectacular, but it comes from the momentum of absorbing all of that, and it sort of going into me and shaping me differently. But it comes from a phone call, literally just picking up a phone and saying to someone, hello, I'm interested in interviewing you and hearing your story. Would you like to do it? And it's about as simple as that. And then the rest of it is really taking in that information and listening to that person tell it in their own words and experiences. I write lots of notes down as well, and then doing research, I guess, around that, pertinent to that person's story. But in this case, I basically let everybody take me by the hand and take me through their story, and that's exactly what Julia does. Yeah, and Jai too. Yeah.
And did you feel a lot of responsibility with this kind of retelling?
Yeah, there's a lot of responsibility. But I also check with people too. I ask them about what they are comfortable talking about and what they're not. I check that I get things right. If I have an idea about, something I'd like to include, but I'm not sure where it sits with them. I'll check. But it comes from spending time with people too. I mean, I think we were there for 2 hours initially, Julia, but we spent a fair bit of time on the phone. I went back another couple of times to do more recording for the letters, and we talked a lot. You told me a lot more about what was going on in your life, and what your beliefs were and what your values are and what you're trying to achieve. I mean, Julia's a really compassionate person. If the definition of compassion is recognizing suffering and trying to take action to alleviate it, that's what Julia does. So there's a lot of that comes out in these podcasts, that what people do to help others. The defense community is a phenomenally supportive community. They help themselves when others can't.
Julia, how did you find that process?
Yeah, it was really good. Like, as Megan said, we spent a lot of time fleshing out what we were going to do. Megan had said, I've listened to the podcast that you did with Beck, and I picked up some themes in there, and I thought that they would be great. And then, I was able to say to her through at that time, there was a lot of suffering in our community. We've been through some tremendous years, from fire assistance to floods to COVID. And even though we've been the most active on home soil for the first time ever, there still wasn't that support outside of our community, and we were still having to try and band together as a community. And we're not one community, we're one community but many communities, because every community at a base is different, every location is different, the support, the wider community there is different as well. So yeah, it was really great to be able to explore those topics and say, like, I have an angle on lust for you, and it's around support at the moment. And in terms of love, we can talk all day about how much love you're seeing thrown around in this community, spouse to spouse, member to spouse at the moment. And it's actually interesting, like, exploring the topics and talking again tonight, because my husband came home last night, and he said, like, oh, I was able to help a partner out today, and like, this is my plan, and she's new and posted into location and everything. And he was like, I knew straight away you'd ask about her, so I'm going to say to them, like, I'm happy to connect you and see if you can help integrate this partner to the community here. So we're starting to see that filter down. So I guess Jai hasn't had any choice but to listen to that and follow suit and take some action. But yeah, like, it was
That's beautiful.
yeah, it was very heartwarming to hear him come home and say that last night. Like, stop before you say anything about the partner.
and also sorry to interrupt, Laura, but also on top of this, to overlay, when I interviewed you, Julia, also Justin and Kendall and Tanya and Mark, our involvement in Afghanistan, like, this amazing pivotal moment, wound up after 20 years. So that you were the first out of the three that I spoke to, and unfortunately, it didn't make the cut. It was, I guess, a little bit too lateral, but we were watching it on our television sets while it was finishing up, and seeing those incredible pictures, for me, that was just like watching, the fall of Saigon again, with the helicopters and people hanging on to the bottom of them. We saw those, heartbreaking scenes of people trying to get out of Afghanistan on those big planes, and the chaos there. And that was in the back of my mind, because Jai deployed twice to Afghanistan. So we were there was a backdrop going on around that as well at the time, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was. And it was interesting then, because like, I remember the Danielle Steele movie, and the scene of the helicopter leaving the roof and the view of Saigon there, and that was what we were watching play out in Afghanistan. And for me, that was the first time that I saw more of what was going on than the landscape in Afghanistan, because I had some photos of his deployment, but the photos that come home, they don't show you what they did over there. They don't show you the landscape necessarily. I mean, there's a backdrop, but I call it, showing you the landscape. And they can be quite guarded about their experiences, and certainly since Afghanistan ended, Jai's talked more about his experience and deployment. I've learned more about particularly his last deployment, what he actually faced over there as far as just themes. Like, he talked about how tough that deployment was, that he didn't feel like he had sufficient time over there, because he was over there for 8 months, but it was kind of also, now reminiscing on it feels like in the blink of an eye it was over. So and just hearing him from another room, and we've had a very big focus in our house on making sure that he's talking to his mates that he deployed with. And actually, I'm due to meet soon some of the people, now that he's back here this year at this unit. He's actually back working with guys that he trained and also deployed with in 2017, and I've never met them.
Wow.
And we're now talking about 2022. So I'm about to meet them, and I've heard them on the phone to each
Wow.
other, checking in. And honestly, at the moment, I've been a defence partner for going on 10 years now, and it's only now that I can say that in our house, I can feel that mateship that they've got. I can feel that courage coming forward in them. They're still continuing to check on mental health and do a check 5 with each other. It's incredible that they're doing that in a climate where they're still so active with COVID assist and their day-to-day jobs. And it's the first time in 10 years that I've seen that. So it's still going on now, as well as in the background. And what's it been now? About 6 months nearly since we recorded that podcast. So it's an incredible climate going on in defence at the moment.
And Julia, what do you hope comes from this podcast? What do you hope that people listening to it at home get from it?
Just that please don't praise us for being resilient. It's the number one thing someone will jump to. Every politician jumps to it. How resilient our defence families and partners are. And, thank you for being patient. And I guess that's the key word there is the patience, more so than the resilience. We don't feel resourceful every day. We are wildly resourceful and capable when we need to be. But, those buckets of resourcefulness can also be depleted. And let's focus more on that patience that we're asking families for, and what do they need to help them with that patience, to perhaps empower them to have that patience. So we need to look more at terms around patience, uncertainty, support, resourcefulness, empowerment of defence families, more so than praising them for being resilient.
And Megan, what do you hope that our listeners get from this podcast?
I hope that they imagine what it might be like for themselves to go through some of these experiences, good, bad, and otherwise, to put themselves in the shoes of the people who I spoke to and who shared their insights and experiences and stories with me. I hope they laugh. I hope they cry. But I guess
the tissues ready. I have them ready, and it's my podcast episode.
But I think maybe learn something, and I don't mean in an educative way, but I guess take away something that maybe they hadn't thought about before or realised before, and realise that these are people in our community, in our neighbourhoods, living right under our noses, standing next to us at the supermarket, wearing a mask, or down the beach or whatever, and actually I think to engage with people and ask them to share a bit about what their experiences are, and so that this sort of dividing wall gets taken apart a bit more. I think we have so much to learn from people who experience military service, so much to learn. It's not all doom and gloom either. One of the things, and I'll just finish with this, one of the things Justin Brown says in episode 2, he says that the amazing, and his wife Kendall, employers really need to consider ex-service people, because they've spent their whole lives training. They're really good at retraining and adapting, you know. That's part of the gig, and being resourceful and flexible, because you have to imagine, you know, what you're going to deal with if you're, especially in a deployment. So I think things like that might help break down some of these barriers. But I just hope they listen with their hearts and minds, and ears wide open, because these stories, they beg a belief. I'm just so addicted to hearing them. I want to know more, and I figure if I do, then maybe others will as well.
I definitely do. You've hit the nail on the head. They're just really engaging, such an interesting insight into something that I've never heard of before. And if you do want to listen to them, they're all up on the Shrine of Remembrance website, or you can search Lust, Love, Lost podcast on your preferred podcast channel. But thank you so much, Julia and Megan, for taking the time to chat with me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Laura. What a great interviewer. Thank you, Julia, too. It was lovely to hear more from you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, ladies. I'm looking forward to hearing the feedback of what people get from the exhibit and the podcast. And yeah, like I'll certainly be following more of your podcast, Megan, because yeah, this one, oh, it touched my heart.
Thank you so much.